right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about some thoughts that I've had about life. And this is really just something that I've been pondering on for a long time. For years, I've been pondering on this. And that is really life is terrifying. All right, this is what I believe. And you have people say, oh, life is beautiful, life is great. Life is terrifying, chaotic, and capricious. And I know this and I believe this because of just what I see around me and the things that I have read about when I have perused through history. Life is terrifying because it is filled with uncertainty. Life is capricious because you don't know when disaster is going to strike. Life is terrifying because, well, for the same damn reason, you don't know when disaster is going to strike. Now, even if you don't live in a genocide or on a battlefield, life is still horrifying because you don't know when your own body is going to declare war on you. What do you think cancer is? Cancer is your body, your flesh declaring war on itself. Cells become cancerous, they become big enough to become the disease that we call cancer, and then your body is in a civil war. Now, millions of people, countless millions of lives have been lost because of civil war. Millions of people were killed as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. Millions of people were killed as a result of the French Revolution. But even if you don't live through a revolution, even if you don't live through a civil war, your body can still go through a civil war with itself. And that is horrifying because you don't know if you're going to survive through it. You have things like autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune diseases are diseases in which your immune system is going to war against your body. It's the same thing with auto-inflammatory diseases like gout. Your own immune system is going against you. Your own flesh can declare war on you. So even if you live a normal life, life is still horrifying. Life is still filled with uncertainty. Life is still capricious and chaotic. And if you look at the history of mankind, what do you see but endless wars, genocides, policies of extermination, plagues, famine, misery, civil wars, misery, endless wars, misery. And you have these white nationalist types who go around saying things like, well, look at these Africans killing each other. You see how barbaric they are? This is proof that the white man is superior to the African. Look at these Middle Easterners killing each other in Syria and in other countries, Yemen. Look, these Middle Eastern people, they're so inferior. They're so barbaric. How do we know that? Look at how they're killing each other all the time. You see, the white man is civilized. Europe is civilized. You see, if you go to Europe, you have a much more calm life, a much more stable life. Well, that is true that Europe has a more stable life than in the Middle East, than in certain parts of the Middle East. That is very true. But here is the thing. White nationalists, right-wingers, people who think that the European is superior to non-Europeans or to Africans or Middle Eastern people are taking for granted the 80-plus years of unprecedented peace. The 80-plus years of unprecedented peace that the Europeans and that the West has been enjoying. You see, after the Second World War, Europeans basically said, okay, let's not do that again. And ever since then, in the last past 80 plus years or so, we have been going through unprecedented peace. With the exception of the Balkans and some other Eastern Europeans, Europe has been going through unprecedented peace for over 80 years. 80 years, over 80 years since the end of the Second World War. The Western world has been relatively stable. And so we have taken this reality for granted. And so we say, look, we're stable, we're peaceful, we're civilized, and these other peoples are not civilized. Therefore, we are superior. Europeans are superior. You guys are taking for granted the fact that for 80 plus years, Europe has been going through unprecedented peace. And what I'm here to tell you is that eventually this unprecedented peace is going to come to an end. Because if you look at European history before the end of the Second World War, it was endless wars. Of course, you had the Second World War, and then before that you had the First World War, and then before that you had endless wars, 30 years war, 100 years war, 50 years of war between Spain and France, the War of the Roses. You had the multiple civil wars, numerous civil wars, I should say, in Europe. You had For example, you had during the 100 Years' War, the King of France going insane, murdering people around him because he lost his mind. He literally goes to a hunting trip, picks up a sword, and then kills people around him. And then so they conclude, okay, this guy lost his mind. So then what happens to the King of France? Well, his brother starts taking over the affairs of the monarchy. His uncle also starts to take over of the affairs of the French monarchy. And then you had two factions, one loyal to the brother, one loyal to the uncle of the king, and before you know it, those factions are killing each other in France, and you have a civil war. You had the War of the Roses. You had the House of York versus the House of Lancaster, butchering each other. Just endless wars. If you look at all of the wars in European history, you can fill up at least one ginormous library filled with books on all of the wars that occurred in European history. And so for the past 80 plus years, Europe has been enjoying relative peace, unprecedented relative peace. And so all of these white nationalists, far-right people, they say, oh, look, you see, we are superior. We're not killing each other. Well, give it some time. When nationalism really starts to kick in, when nationalism really entrenches itself in European society, you are going to be seeing the barbarism of Europe coming back from the dead and being revived. You're already getting a sample of this in Ukraine, and you already got a sample of this in the 1990s back in the Balkans. The reality is that human history has been filled with wars. Human existence is filled with wars. And if you look at the Second World War, it was riddled with all sorts of bloodshed, mass murder. The Ukrainians butchered 100,000 Poles. The Germans killed millions of Poles. I want to say at least 2 million Poles were butchered by the Third Reich. And then you have the violence in the Balkans, the Croatians, the Croatian nationalists who called themselves Ustasha. Well, they murdered hundreds of thousands of Serbs. They also murdered Jews, Gypsies. I think they killed at least 1 million people in total. They murdered 600,000 Serbs in just one death camp alone. I mean, misery, absolute misery. This is the human experience, filled with misery. This is why I say, life is terrifying. I don't care what anyone tells me. You have people who say, oh no, life is beautiful. Look, God has blessed me with all this prosperity. So because you have prosperity, that means that God is with you. Well, you know what? Germany had tremendous prosperity under Hitler. Are you going to say that God was with Hitler? Are you going to say that God was not with the Armenians because the Armenians were being genocided? Are you going to say that God was not with the Greeks or the Assyrians during World War I because they were being genocided by the Ottoman Empire? Oh, and Germany's official policy was to not intervene to save any Armenian life because the Armenians were an ally of Russia. Russia was and it still is, the nemesis of Germany. And so Germany said, do not help any ally of the Russians. The Armenians were an ally of the Russians, so allow the Turks to genocide them. This was German official policy. And Germany was much more prosperous than the Armenians, much more prosperous than the Greeks, much more prosperous than the Assyrians. Are we going to say that God was with the Germans and not those Christians who were butchered? Oh, and that's right. God himself was murdered. You see, this is how evil the world is. God himself became human, and he got murdered. That's how evil and that's how horrifying the world is, that God himself took upon the whole of humanity and he got murdered. Life is terrifying. Even if you live a normal life, you go into an airplane, you don't know if the airplane is going to crash. You get into a car, you don't know if the car is going to crash. You get into an elevator, you don't know if the elevator is going to get stuck in the middle of a building. You go into the grocery store, you don't know if you're going to be a victim of a mass shooting. Life is filled with uncertainty. And this idea that because you are prosperous or because you are wealthy or because you are living a comfortable life is a sign that God is with you is utter bullshit. Because if you look at the history of Christianity, what do you see? It is filled with misery, persecution, dead bodies, people getting eaten by lions, people getting burned alive. Hell, St. John himself was fried in oil alive. St. Paul was beheaded. St. Peter was crucified upside down. The saints of Christian history were persecuted. And then before that, God himself became human and he got martyred. And so God is saying, life is miserable, the world is filled with misery, and guess what? I am suffering with you. And this is the message of Christianity. Here is the horrifying reality. The horrifying reality is that we are living in the devil's playground. How do I know this? Well, look at the book of Job, the oldest book in the Bible. Job is very devout. Job is very devout. Job is dedicated to God. Job is a worshiper of God. Job is a righteous man, and he has all this wealth, all this prosperity. He has all this land. He has this thriving family. And the devil says, hey, God, I bet you anything that the reason why Job is devout to you is because he lives very comfortable. Now, I bet if I take away his comfort, he will reject you and deny you. And so God says, okay, Satan, you want to test him? Go right ahead. And so the devil tests Job and inflicts upon Job all sorts of misery. His family members are being killed. His servants get killed. His land gets raided by Chaldeans and Sabaeans. His whole life becomes miserable. His entire body gets covered in boils. Absolute misery. And so Job lives the reality of life, which is what? Capriciousness, chaos, misery, terror, consternation. It's absolutely nightmarish. It is absolutely harrowing what Job is going through. And his wife says, Job, why don't you curse God and die? This is what the devil wanted Job to say, and the devil was influencing his wife to get him to say that, because this is what Satan wants, which really reminds us of the fact that we are living in the devil's playground. The devil influences people, tries to get people to do evil things, tries to get people to say evil things, tries to convince people of evil ideas. We are living in Satan's playground. And so what does God do? God becomes man to suffer with us. God says, there is misery, there is suffering, it is horrifying, life is horrifying, but I'm going to go through it with you, and this is our consolation. But nonetheless, the reality still is, life is horrifying, life is filled with misery, life is filled with consternation. The Armenian Genocide, Second World War, World War I, the 30 Years' War, the 50 years of warfare between France and Spain, just endless, non-stop warfare, Rwandan Genocide, the French Revolution. Millions of people were killed in the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which led to the deaths of countless millions of people, communism, which led to the deaths of countless millions of people. Life is horrifying. And God is saying, I know it's horrifying. I suffered with you. This is the consolation that we get from Christianity. But nonetheless, there is still the harrowing nature of life. And why is life so terrifying? Life is terrifying for the most part because human beings are evil. And when you look at the book of Genesis, what does it say not too long after Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit? It says, and man will be inclined to do evil from his very birth. And so human beings are filled with evil, and for this reason, the world is horrified. Now, I understand that they are natural disasters, diseases, etc., but for the most part, our miseries come from other humans. And so life is terrifying. You have people who say, oh no, Ted, life is beautiful. And you have these Christian types who come along and they say, life is great, Ted. It's about what you make life to be. Listen, if you are an Armenian and you're going through the Armenian Genocide during World War I and you are forced to eat nothing but a few little pieces of bread every week or so, and you're just given a few drops of water just to keep you barely alive, and then eventually you get starved to death or dehydrated to death, or eventually you get cut to pieces by Kurdish bandits, you're not going to be telling me it's about what you make life to be. Life is not really miserable. It's about what you make it out to be. No. Life is horrifying. You don't know if you're going to be a member. You don't know if you're going to be a victim of a genocide. You don't know if you're going to be in the middle of a war. You don't know if you're going to be in the middle of a battlefield. You don't know if one day you're going to be a refugee. Life is horrifying. People speak of phobias. They say, oh, people have phobias, irrational fears, right? You have people who are terrified of getting on an airplane. And people will say, psychiatrists will say, well, this is an irrational fear. Why is it irrational? I mean, you're getting inside of a metal beast, and now you're hovering in the middle of the sky, and a lot of the times you are overlooking the ocean. You look out the window on your airplane, and you see nothing but a giant ocean. So if the plane crashes, you're going to become shark food. It's horrifying. I think fear of flying in planes is not really irrational. I mean, people can become hysterical about it, but is it really irrational? It is quite horrifying. The idea of getting inside of a metal object and flying thousands upon thousands of feet above the earth is pretty frightening. It's not really irrational. But the reason why we go into airplanes with ease, the reason why every single day people get into airplanes with ease without much fear, or really without any fear at all, is because of probability. What is the probability of a plane crashing? Pretty damn low. I mean, hundreds upon hundreds of planes fly every single day, every hour. You have tons of planes flying, and you don't really hear about crashes all too often. So the probability of the plane crashing is very low, but still there is nonetheless a chance that the plane will crash. So it is still uncertain, and that misery of going through a plane crash is, well, it's still possible. And because it's possible, there is uncertainty. And because there is uncertainty, life is filled with dread. You go into a grocery store, what is the chances of you being a victim of a mass shooting? Pretty low, given the number of mass shootings that happen every year. But still, there is a possibility that it can indeed happen. I remember years ago, I went to a cafe and this woman approached me and she was telling me all this random stuff about how she hated her mom and how she wanted to kill herself. And then she starts telling me, and this is really, really horrifying. I mean, really horrifying. She starts telling me about how and this really did happen. You can't make this stuff up. She starts telling me about how she is attracted to little boys. Yes, she actually tells me this. And it's one thing to talk about it and to hear a story like that. And it's another thing to actually hear that directly from someone in real life. You're not hearing about this on a YouTube video. You're not hearing about this on some police body cam video. You're hearing this from the actual predator, him or herself, and they're right in front of you. And I'm telling you, I have never experienced anything like that before. I had never experienced anything like that before. And goosebumps were all over my body. I was literally breaking a sweat. I was horrified. And I said, all right. And I got up and I booked it. I mean, I power walked out of there. And she was talking about how she could just, before she brought up this evil degeneracy, she was telling me about how she was saying I could just get a giant pistol and just blow my brains out right here. And all these thoughts are running through my mind. I'm thinking, is she going to shoot up the place? She's obviously extremely evil. She's very degenerate. I mean, this is horrifying. I was literally breaking a sweat. And I felt like I was in the presence of evil because I was. And I remember getting up and just power walking the hell out of there. Of course, I made a complaint to the manager, and they took a statement for me, and they told me that they were going to call up the police, et cetera, et cetera. But just experiencing that was absolutely horrifying. And you don't know if you're going to run into someone like that again. You don't know if one day maybe they could actually do something really destructive or violent in the place that you're in. You don't know. Life is horrifying. And then you look at something like the Rwandan genocide, and you read about how, the Hutsis or the Houthis killed 500,000 people in Rwanda. They killed 500,000 people because they were members of a nation called the Tutsis, and so the Tutsis were more successful than the Houthis, and so the Houthis butchered the Tutsis, and they massacred 500,000 people. And those poor people, they didn't see what was coming initially, and it's just horrifying. You read something like that, and people will say, well, where was God? Where was God in all this stuff? And if you read about the Armenian genocide, the Armenians were asking the same thing. This is recorded and documented in this book, written by an Armenian genocide survivor by the name of Grigoris Balakian. If you have not read this book, and if you are interested in genocide, if you are not if you are enthusiastic about genocide, but if you are interested in the history of genocide, how genocide works, how people are convinced that genocide is a good thing, and that's very, very scary. If you're interested in the Armenian genocide, this is definitely I would say this is definitely required reading. And he talks about how he saw so much misery and so much starvation and people being killed by the Ottoman regime, and he wondered to himself, where is God in all this? And I would be asking the same thing. I mean, I'm a human being. I'm weak. We are weak in the flesh. There's that story of Christ knowing that he was about to be crucified, knowing that he was going to be murdered in a very brutal way, and Christ himself was sweating blood. Christ was terrified. He was terrified. And I love that about the gospel. I love that about Christianity, because it shows that God suffered with us. He suffers with humanity. And so Christ was terrified, and Christ felt the capriciousness of human life. And he goes to his disciples and he says, would you guys just pray with me for an hour? And they keep falling asleep. And then what does Christ tell the disciples? He says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. My spirit is willing to be courageous and to have endurance and to push through and to strive, but my flesh is very, very weak. And so in a state of misery, such as, being in the middle of a genocide, I would be wondering, where is God in all this? It is of mankind's nature to ask, where is God, as he is suffering? But at the same time, we remember what God the Son said when he was nailed onto a cross. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so, because God took upon the whole of humanity, he also took upon the whole of mankind's misery. And while he was on that cross, he asked the question that mankind asks when mankind is going through atrocities and genocides and utter, horrific, nightmarish, harrowing miseries. We can sit there and say, oh, well, look how prosperous I am. This is proof that God is with me. But they are Christians who have been killed in Gaza by the Israelis. Are you then saying that God is not with them? And if God himself suffered, who the hell are we to say that we are exempt from suffering? And then you see what's been happening in Gaza and how you have Israeli soldiers who will kidnap Gazan civilians and force them to go and be human bomb sniffers. Literally, they have them go into homes. They have them go from home to home to home looking for bombs. And if they come upon a bomb, if they find a bomb, the bomb blows up and they die. And the Israelis normally would use dogs to find bombs, but instead now they're using Gazan civilians and they're forcing them to look for bombs because, well, according to these IDF officers, the life of a Gazan is worth less than that of a dog. And so they are forcing these people to be human bomb sniffers. And it's become actual policy. There was an article that was published on this recently by AP News, and this article shows how there was a brigadier commander doing a presentation in which he showed slides. And on one of the slides, it says, use a mosquito to detect bombs. Well, what did he mean by mosquito? He meant a Palestinian. So they will take a Palestinian and force this person to go out and look for bombs so that if there is a bomb, the bomb will kill him and not a dog, or the bomb won't destroy a robot. And they call these Palestinian bomb detectors mosquitoes. It reminds me of what the Japanese did to the Chinese during the Second World War. You had Unit 731. This was a Japanese unit that was dedicated to doing human experimentation. They would take Chinese people and they would infect them with disease, and they would do all sorts of horrific experiments on them. And they would call these Chinese people logs. That's what they would call them. And so when they would put on record the things that they did, so every day they would have to write down the things that they did, they would say, oh, well, today we killed this many logs. And so you read that, you think, oh, logs, oh, okay, they're putting trees down a wood chipper or something like that. No. They're killing humans. That's what Unit 731 meant. But they called their victims logs. And if you read about the Nazi human experiments, when the Nazis made records of their human experiments, they wouldn't say we killed this many people or we did this to this human being. They would say, today we experimented on a pig, we experimented on this cattle animal or this type of animal. So when the Americans found these records, when they were reading the records, these records were saying, oh, we did this to this animal. We worked on this animal. And the reason why the Germans did this was so that they can say, oh, well, we were simply working on animals. But nonetheless, it reflected how they dehumanized their victims. And so when the Israelis say, use a mosquito, they are dehumanizing their victims. And these people who get forced to be bomb detectors, they're captured. Sometimes they're just walking on the side of the road somewhere and boom, Israelis capture them. They put them in the vehicle and they say, okay, we're going to force you to be a human bomb detector. In one instance, they took some poor Palestinian elderly man who couldn't walk without a cane and they wrapped a wire around his neck and they forced him to go from house to house to house for 8 hours. Then they released him, and then another Israeli unit came along and they killed him and his wife. They shot him and his wife, just murdered them right there. And you look at these miseries and you say, well, life is horrifying. You don't know if you're going to be a victim of this very same nightmare. But you have people who say, well, I'm prosperous, I'm comfortable, so God is with me. So you're saying that God is not with people in Gaza? Are you saying that God is not with Christians in Gaza? Are you saying that because these people are suffering, that God has somehow abandoned them? Is that what you're saying? You're just like the friends of Job who blamed Job's miseries on him, saying that you must have done something to lose the favor of God, and that is why you're so miserable, and that's why you're going through all these travails. No, the reality is that life is filled with misery. Life is filled with horror. The reality is that life is terrifying. And I don't have all the answers for it. I can't sit here and give you the absolute solution to go through this. I'm just giving you guys my thoughts on this. Life is miserable. That's what I know. And I also know that life is so miserable. I also know that mankind is so filled with evil that God himself became man and he was murdered. And so God is saying, I know life is miserable. I know life is terrifying. I know that life is so filled with evil because I went to the world. I became man and I was murdered by the evildoers. And then you read more about how the Israelis use human beings to be bomb detectors. And I read this story yesterday where the Israelis took some poor Palestinian guy and forced him to go into a tunnel, a really, really narrow tunnel. And the guy passed out and died. And you're thinking, man, that's obviously horrifying. And then you realize life is horrifying. And a lot of times we in America, we in the Western world, we forget that life is horrifying because we live in relative comfort. But life is horrifying. I know it's a doomer take, and it is a doomer take. I know it's going to sound like a doomer take because it is, but it's just the reality. And that doesn't mean that I have to deny the existence of God. Because people will say, well, how do you reconcile the reality of mankind's plight with your belief in the existence of God? My answer is that these things have already been reconciled in the Christian religion. It's not like Christianity teaches, well, everything's going to be okay because God's around. No. Christianity teaches that things are not okay, that mankind is so evil that mankind killed God himself. And that evil is reflected in all of the tyrannical, genocidal regimes of history, from the Mongolian Empire, going all the way to the Timurids, to the Ottomans, to all the different various communist regimes, the French Revolution before that, and then you had the Nazi regime, the Third Reich. All of these evil regimes are a reflection of the wickedness and the evil inclinations of mankind. And the devil comes along and he knows about man's inclinations and he manipulates those inclinations to convince man to do evil. And so he goes to the Germans and he says, you see these non-Germans? Look at how barbaric they are. He goes to the non-Germans, he goes to the non-white people, and he says, the white man hates you. Go out and kill white people, or talk about how much you hate white people and just complain about white people and piss the white man off. And then he goes to the white man and he says, you see these colored people, these non-whites, you see they hate you and they're inferior to you. That's why they have all this crime. And he convinces the white man to agree to Darwinian genocide. We are living in the devil's playground. I can't fully explain it. I mean, these things are beyond my comprehension, but I can observe things enough to recognize this reality. We are living in the devil's playground. And if you don't believe me, look at the book of Job. The devil goes to God and says, the devil goes to God and says, God, I can get Job to reject you. And God says, okay. And the devil inflicts Job with all sorts of miseries with the hopes of getting Job to reject God. We are living in the devil's playground. That's the reality. And this whole life is a test. It's a whole test, and the demonic influence is all over the place. You go to the Democrat Party, and they are explicitly demonic. I mean, they support abortion and gay marriage. But then you go to the conservative world, and they're not as explicitly evil, but they will begin to push things like Darwinism and like Nazism or racist or racialist nationalism. And you see that evil right there. Why is it? Why is it that no matter where you go in the political sphere, you find evil? Because this life is a war. This is what Job says in the book of Job. He says, the life of man is warfare. It's a war between who? It's a war between the forces of life and the forces of death. And what does it say in Proverbs? It says, all those who hate me, God, love death. And if you look at that verse, it's very fascinating because wisdom is speaking in this verse. If you read the whole chapter, it's a narration from wisdom himself. Wisdom is speaking. And what does St. Paul say? What does St. Paul say about God the Son, Christ? He says that Christ is who? The wisdom of God, the wisdom of the Father. So this is Christ speaking in the book of Proverbs. And Christ is saying in the book of Proverbs, all those who hate me love death. And so the entire war that we are in is a war between the forces of life and the forces of death, people who love murder and they love bloodshed. And that's why when you look at all these satanic groups, ideologies, organizations, they are bent on what? Destruction. Cain murdered his brother. This is what St. John tells us. He says, and Cain murdered his brother. And why did Cain murder his brother? Because Cain was of the evil one. Cain followed the devil. He was of the army of death. And amazingly, what does Jesus tell the priests? What does he tell the religious establishment of Judea? He says, you have murdered all the prophets, going all the way back to Abel. You murdered Abel. Well, was Cain a member of the Jewish religious establishment? No, he wasn't. So what is Christ talking about? Christ is telling the religious establishment of Judea, you guys are a part of the entire satanic army. You guys are a part of the whole thing, going all the way back to Cain, because you are of the same spirit as Cain. And that's why they killed Christ, because Christ is represented by Abel. And Cain is represented by all of the acolytes of the diabolical. And so they murdered Christ, just as Cain murdered Abel. This entire existence of ours is a war between the forces of good and the forces of evil, the forces of life and the forces of death. And what does Jesus say about Satan? He says he was a murderer from the beginning. And that's why all these diabolical organizations, ideologies, they are bent on death, human destruction, murder, mass murder, genocide. If you look at the Ottoman Empire with its amalgamation of Islam and Darwinism, if you look at Nazi Germany with its Darwinism and nationalism, if you look at the communist regimes with its atheism, Darwinism, and anti-Christianity, they were all murderous. The French Revolution with its paganism, deism, and anti-clericalism, it was filled with mass murder. And what did these regimes bring about? What did they bring about? Misery, 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 fear, horror. That's why I love that movie, Come and See. If you have not seen the film Come and See, I urge you to see the film. Come and see the film. You can watch it for free on YouTube. It has subtitles. Come and See. Beautiful, harrowingly beautiful, hauntingly beautiful Soviet film from the mid-1980s. And that film depicts the miseries that Nazism brought about in a very artistic way. It can be aesthetically very beautiful, but at the same time, it's harrowing. It's artwork. It truly is artwork. And that film illustrates the miseries that Nazism brought. But ultimately speaking, it illustrates the miseries that the diabolical brings about. Just the love of death, the love of cruelty, the love of brutality. And this is what Satan brings. And so I look at all the different factions, the right-wing factions. I know a lot of you guys love the right-wing factions, be it the French New Right or be it the alt-right or the AFD or any sort of nationalist groups. You guys love these groups. And you look at the left-wing groups and you find obvious evil there, but you find evil in everything. You find evil in all these different factions. Why? Because the devil is so bent on deceiving us to enter the path of destruction that he will even use Christianity, he will even influence these groups to use Christianity to get us to follow those groups. Just like the people who killed Christ were not liberals, these weren't pagans, these were people who believed in the God of Israel, and they followed the scriptures and they read the scriptures and all that stuff. I mean, they were on face value, they were very conservative, they had family values, and yet they murdered the Messiah, they murdered God in the flesh. The devil will come in the form of a conservative. Satan will use conservatism to deceive people. And those right-wing ideologies that have a facade of Christianity, or they have a facade of conservative values or Christian values, Many times these groups, these ideologies will bring about destruction. They will bring about destruction because they are obsessed with what? Nation and race, and many times they believe in evolutionism. I was reading about this French right-winger today. I think his name is Bernard Lugan. Yeah, Bernard Lugan. And Bernard Lugan he's famous in the French right-wing circles. And Bernard Lugan is, he's a right-winger, and he was with Action Francois, which was and still is. I don't know if it's still around, but Action Francois was a very famous far-right French organization. If it's still around today, it's definitely around, as it's definitely very influential in the right-wing movement in France today. But if you look at Bernard Lugan, he's a conservative guy, right-wing guy. But then you can read an interview of his where he says that African people are having too many children, and that and he even decries the malaria vaccine. And he says, well, the malaria vaccine is a terrible thing because if you give Africans the malaria vaccine, that means you're going to have more Africans. This is what he says. He says, you're going to have more Africans, and this is going to be a disaster. Well, I thought you were supposed to be this right-wing guy. You're supposed to have these right-wing values, but here you are embracing death and pushing for this Malthusian death cult, where you want to enable the spread of malaria. You want more malaria in Africa because you want less Africans and you want more dead Africans. I mean, this is pure evil. And so I was reading this stuff today, and I'm thinking to myself, no matter where you go, whether you go to the liberals, whether you go to the right wing or the left wing, it doesn't matter. You find atrocious evil. Why? Because the devil is so bent on deceiving us that he will come across as conservative, that he will push these groups that are evil, but they are being pushed under the facade of conservative values to deceive us. And what does Christ say about the Antichrist? That he will deceive the very elect if it were possible. In other words, he is going to come across as a good Christian. And when the Germans were pushing for the Anschluss, in which they wanted to take over Austria, they had the Austrians do a referendum in which they got the chance to vote over whether or not they wanted to be under Germany. Of course, the majority of Austrians voted in favor of the Anschluss, but they were Austrian Nazis who were definitely pushing for the Anschluss. And one thing that they said was that if the Nazis take over Austria, if Germany takes over Austria, then we are going to have a free Christian Austria with family values. This is what they were saying to market the Nazis. They were using family values and Christianity to market for the Nazis. That was happening then. That was happening in the 1930s. And they were doing this in the 1940s. I mean, when the Croatians were butchering the Serbs, they weren't doing so in the name of atheism. They were doing so in the name of God. You had clergy members, and I think you even had nuns in Croatia who participated in this. The deception is that real. That real. And what does St. Peter say? He says, be vigilant, for the devil is like a roaring lion looking for whoever he can devour. What does that mean? That's talking about deception. Jesus says, be as cunning as serpents, but be as innocent as doves. Why as cunning as serpents? Because we have to understand the ways of the diabolical. And if you understand the ways of the diabolical, one thing that you will be able to anticipate is that the diabolical comes in the facade of Christian values. And the deception is that real, because this life is not here. This life is not meant to be comfortable all the time. This life is a war, no matter how you look at it. We are in a war. It's a war over our souls. It's a war over our minds. And once we understand that, then we know that it's not just, we know that the threat is not just coming from the left. The deception is coming from the right. In fact, there is no deception coming out of the left. The left is blatant about what it is. We know the left bad. That's why all the conservatives attack the left. The left is this big piñata because we know it's bad. Communism, we know, is blatantly anti-Christian. But the Nazis, they came with the face of pro-Christianity. And they were mass murderers. They were mass murderers. So what does this reality reflect? This reality reflects the terrifying reality of life. This life is terrifying. It is, because it's so filled with evil. but we have solace in the fact that God suffers with us. And that's the best that I can do as far as explaining this goes. Anyway, misery does not prove that God does not exist. Misery doesn't prove that there is no God. A lot of atheists like to utilize this argument, and they'll say, well, bad things means no God. But that's just not true. Just because there's misery doesn't mean there is no creator. It just means that there's misery. That's all that proves. But at the same time, you have atheists who like to attribute to Christianity, or they like to attribute to God things that God has never said, or things that Christianity doesn't teach, such as, well, if there is a God, then the world will be nice and comfortable and perfect. And if you think about it, the prosperity gospel and atheists sort of align in some way, because the prosperity gospel Christians, I don't want to call them Christians, but the prosperity gospel cultists like to say, well, I am prosperous in life, therefore God is on my side, God's got my back. And then the atheists come along and say, well, if God was real, then there wouldn't be all this misery and people would be prosperous. So both have this belief that prosperity is a sign, or that perfect prosperity or perfect comfort in society is a sign that God is there, or that God is on our side. And that's why I say they sort of align to some extent or another. So if you look at the prosperity heretics or the prosperity cultists, they say, look at all the prosperity that I have, God is on my side. Well, if you were an Armenian Christian living in the year 1916, you would be very devout, you would be going to church, you would be confessing your sins, you would be taking communion, or at least wanting to take communion, because a lot of times Christians were not allowed to take communion because of the tyranny of the Ottoman Empire. But at the same time, you would be going through a genocide. So if prosperity equals God is with you, then would you make the argument that that God was not with the Armenians because they were going through a genocide? And that worldview, that prosperity gospel paradigm, is completely antithetical to Christianity, because Christianity teaches that misery is a part of life, that life is terrifying, and human life, human existence is so filled with evil that God himself became man and was killed himself. My bottom line is, my main point is, life is terrifying and we should just accept this. This is my whole point. And God himself became man, and the world is so filled with evil that they killed God. And through that experience of participating in the suffering of mankind and in the miseries and vicissitudes of life, we got redemption. So Christianity does not teach anything about, oh, well, if you have prosperity, that means God is with you. Christianity teaches the opposite. Christianity teaches that this world is filled with misery, horror. This world is harrowing. This world is a nightmare. This world is horrifying. And so we accept it, and God himself participates in our suffering. And through that, we have redemption. That is the Christian message. And so the prosperity way of thinking, or the atheist worldview, which says, well, this atheist worldview, which says that if God was real, there would be perfection, and this prosperity heresy that says, well, prosperity is a sign of God's existence and God being on our side. Both of these viewpoints, they align in some way, and they're both evil. And not only are they evil, but they are, and I'll say this especially for the prosperity gospel is not only evil and demonic, but it is a sign of a privileged life, because you can only have a privileged, comfortable life to believe that bullshit, because you live in the United States, and the United States, relatively speaking, has a pretty comfortable life, especially when you compare it to people living in Gaza, or people living in North Sudan, or South Sudan for that matter. We in America, we in the Western world, live relatively comfortable lives. And we think, well, look at how comfortable we are. This is a sign that God is with us. Well, are you then going to make the argument that God is not with Christians in Syria? Are you then going to make the argument that God is not with Christians in Iraq? Are you then going to make the argument that God is not with Christians in Turkey, or not with Christians who are living in parts of Africa where Muslim persecution is something that actually happens every single year, especially when you go to places like Nigeria, or when you go to other sub-Saharan African countries? Is God not with any of these people? And if you believe that prosperity equals God is with you or God is on your side, then you're no different than the friends of Job, who, when he was suffering, told him, well, the reason why you're suffering is because you must have angered God for some reason. And they're putting the blame on Job, and they're saying that, Job, the reason why you're suffering is because you must have pissed God off. You must have done some sins, and that's why you're miserable. And God gets angry with the friends of Job, and he makes them apologize. He makes them take what they said back, because it is bullshit. Life, people go through miserable things. Not necessarily. Sometimes people go through misery. A lot of times, actually, people go through misery because of their own wrongdoing. They're taking drugs, they're drinking and driving. People go through miseries because of their own actions. I'm not denying that. Obviously, that's true. But a lot of the times also, people go through miserable things because. Not because of any fault of their own. It's because they just go through miserable things. The Armenians who were being forced into death marches by the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, they didn't do anything to deserve that. They were just normal people living their normal lives. And they lived comfortable lives. They lived comfortable lives before the Armenian genocide. Not all the time, but relatively speaking, they were Armenians. And Grigoris Balakian documents this. They were Armenians who lived relatively comfortable lives. And before they knew it, their houses were taken, their property was taken, and their daughters were getting raped, and they were being butchered and massacred. And the same thing is to be said for the Greeks who were living in the Ottoman Empire and the Assyrians who were living in the Ottoman Empire. And there's a verse in the book of Proverbs that says what? It says that the disasters of the world, the miseries of the world, fall on the good and the bad. Because this is the fact of life. It is a doomerish take, but guess what? Christianity is a doomer religion. Don't take it the wrong way, but that's what it is. It's a doomer religion where you have to just face the reality. You have to face the reality because God himself faced this reality when he became man. And he took upon the whole of humanity. St. Theodore the Studite tells us this in his book Against the Iconoclasts. He says that God the Son took upon the whole of humanity. And so because God took upon the whole of humanity, he also partook in the vicissitudes and the miseries of life, the horror of life. And I can go on and on and on about the miseries of human existence. We can talk about the French Revolution. I mean, let's be real here. The French Revolution was a white Uganda, a white Rwanda. There was the Rwandan genocide. The Houthis butchered 500,000 Tutsis. And we say, oh, look, the Africans are barbaric and we Europeans are better and we're more sophisticated or we're more superior to them because look at what they're doing to each other. We Europeans don't do that. But then you go to the French Revolution in the late 18th century and you read about how 3 million people were butchered in the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a white Rwanda. It was a European Rwanda. And they were devout Catholics who said, we don't want to acquiesce to the anti-Christian decrees of the French Revolution, such as turning in your priests. Because when the French Revolution was established, they said, okay, Catholic priests need to become a part of the new revolutionary church. Some priests did it. Some priests did conform, but most priests refused to acquiesce to this demand. And so it was open season on the priest. They said, okay, well, the priests need to die. And so then what happened? The people were required to report a priest if a priest was hiding somewhere. If you knew the whereabouts of the priest, you had to report him. That was the law. Well, a lot of Catholics in France refused to acquiesce to this rule, and so they were butchered. And people were massacred. And millions of people were butchered to a great extent because of anti-Christian laws, but there were other reasons as to why people were butchered. Regardless, though, 3 million people were killed in the French Revolution. It was a European Rwanda. And so what? Did the white man just start to evolve after the French Revolution? Did the white man only begin to evolve above the African or above the Middle Easterner in the last 80 years or so? Is that when the white man began to evolve above the condition of the African or the condition of the Middle Easterner? Because you have this idea that's becoming very popular online that says that the white man is more evolved than the African or the Middle Easterner. But during the French Revolution, there was much barbarism. In fact, we can talk about cannibalism in Africa. But during the French Revolution, there were instances of cannibalism. There is a story that you can read in which you had these French rebels who spent hours decapitating people, and they were decapitating people for such a long time that they actually became exhausted. And so they said, "Let's take a rest and let's have some wine." And so a lady came over with a bottle of wine. She poured them some glasses of wine, and then these decapitators proceeded to take blood from their victims, and they began to pour the blood into the wine, and they mixed the wine with the blood, and they said, "Here, let's drink some wine and refresh ourselves." And they drank wine and blood. I mean, obviously this is very satanic, obviously this is very demonic, but this was done by Europeans. This was not being done by African voodooists. This wasn't being done by Middle Eastern people in Syria. This was being done by Europeans in the late 18th century, not the medieval period. This wasn't being done by Gauls in the middle of Caesar's takeover of Gaul. No. This was being done by civilized late 18th century France, with all of its Baroque artwork and all of its Baroque civilizational music and all of its Baroque aesthetics and beautiful aesthetics. French people, in the midst of all that artistic masterfulness, were doing horrors such as that. And then you rewind, or you fast forward to the 20th century, and you read about how Ukrainian nationalists butchered 100,000 Poles, at least 100,000 Poles. Croatian nationalists butchered 600,000 Serbs in just one concentration camp alone, let alone the other concentration camps that they had. They had one concentration camp that was completely dedicated to murdering Serbian children, and I think they were doing experiments on Serbian kids in that camp. And this was done by Europeans. And so it's only in the last 80 plus years, when Europeans have been relatively peaceful, but because human history is so filled with misery, and because the future is simply a reflection of the past, I'm here to tell you guys that this unprecedented peace that we have become so accustomed to in the Western world is going to come to an end, and the barbarism of Europe will come back from the dead and will be revived. Why? Because, as I said in the beginning of this video, this world is horrifying because of the evils of mankind. And what does it say in the book of Genesis after Adam and Eve ate the fruit? It says that man will be inclined to do evil from his very birth. That is horrifying. We have had this inclination to do evil from the time of our birth. Tell me that's not horrifying. That is horrifying. That we have that inclination, that we have that choice to do evil. And why does God give us this choice to do evil? Because God wants us to choose to love him. If we cannot choose to love God, if we love God because, let's say, God hardwired us to love him, and we don't choose to love him, but we just love him because we're forced to do so by some sort of predetermined biological nature, then that would not be love. That would just be force, and you cannot find force in love. So he wants us to choose to love him, and because he gave us the ability and the free will to choose to love him, that means we have the free will to choose to hate him. And because we have the free will to choose to hate God, that means we can do any evil that we want. And that's why you find in the records of humanity every evil imaginable being done, from the perpetrators, from being done by perpetrators such as Ted Bundy, Edmund Kemper, Jeffrey Dahmer, what's his name, Mr. Ramirez, the LA stalker, all the mass shooters, Columbine shooters, all of the SS officers, the orchestrators of genocide, the Armenian genocide. Every evil that human beings can do, human beings have done, still do, and will continue to do. Because human beings have a freedom to choose to do evil. And because God wants us to choose him and not be forced to choose him, therefore there is free will. And we live in a world where mankind can choose evil, because God wants to truly see who truly loves him and who truly hates him, because God wants to separate the sheep from the wolves. So because God allows this freedom, because he wants us to have true love, and he wants us to have an authentic love for him. He allows us to do evil. And so the world is filled with misery. And so because the world has a freedom to choose evil, that means the devil can manipulate humanity to do evil, and the devil can manipulate humanity to choose evil and to choose him, just as he brought about misery for Job to get Job to reject God, but that didn't work. So the reality, my friends, and don't take this the wrong way, I don't mean this in any heretical way at all, but the reality is that we are living in the devil's playground, and that shit is horrifying. That shit is horrifying. But in the end, as we all know, we win. In the end, we win. And God allows the devil to think that he's winning. The whole world went to paganism. At one point in time, all of humanity knew who the true God was. You look at Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they all knew who the true God was. But eventually mankind spiraled downwards into paganism and went down the path of paganism. And so all of humanity was pagan. And the devil told God, I'm sure, hey, God, look, I got the whole world in my hands. The world is my playground. And I'm sure God said, all right, go right ahead. I'm going to pick one nation, Israel, Judea, the Jewish people. I'm going to pick one nation to represent me. And the Messiah who will bring redemption for all of mankind will come through the Jews, will come through the line of Shem in Israel. And so there was this one nation who was supposed to be a light to the world. And the devil came along and said, you know what, God, I'm going to take that nation too. And God said, okay, go ahead. And the devil took it. And the Messiah comes, and the devil influenced all those people to cry out, crucify the Messiah, crucify the Messiah. And the Messiah was crucified. And the devil said, you see, God, I got your people, the people that you chose to kill your son. And God said, okay, no problem. No problem, because look back what it says in the book of Genesis, where Noah says, and Japheth will reside in the tents of Shem. The Messiah comes through the line of Shem, Shem being the patriarch of the entire Semitic race. The Messiah comes from his line. And so that's why Noah says, blessed be the God of Shem. And then he says, may God enlarge Japheth, and may Japheth reside in the tents of Shem. What are the tents? The temples, the churches. So Japheth is destined to enter the temples of Shem and to worship the God of Shem. Remember what Noah says, blessed be the God of Shem. And so Japheth entered the temples of Shem. So the devil said, oh, I got Israel. They killed the Messiah. They killed your son, God. And God says, don't worry. Don't worry. Well, the devil's not worried. God says, okay, no problem. I have Japheth. And Japheth entered the tents of Shem, and Japheth followed the Messiah, and Europe became Christendom. Europe went from being either the pagan Roman Empire or just a bunch of barbarian hordes, and it went from that to becoming Christendom, and the Roman Empire became what? Christendom. And God went to someone named Constantine, and Constantine was about to have a war against the pagans who were persecuting the Christians in the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And Constantine sees a sign in the air. What is it? It's the cross. And God says, by this sign you shall conquer. And Constantine tells all of his men, put this sign on your shields. And that was the beginning of Christendom. And so the devil comes out and says, I'm going to take over all of Christendom. I'm gonna get the Christian world, the Japhetic world, to follow communism and Nazism and paganism and all this crazy anti-Christian stuff. God says, okay. He allows it because he wants to know who are his true sheep and who are the wolves. And so it's because of that freedom that evil is allowed to thrive, but it's also because of that freedom that we know who truly chooses good. And it's because of that freedom that mankind, in this case the Judeans, killed the Messiah. They had the freedom to do it. They were enabled to do it. But at the same time, it is because of that freedom that we know who truly follows the Messiah. And it's because of that freedom that God partook in the suffering of man and that we have redemption. Life is horrifying. Life is Scary. It really is, to say the least. But God knows it. And God participated in the vicissitudes and miseries of human existence. And because of that acceptance of this reality, there is redemption and there is consolation. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.